Okay.
Don't mind, I'm just trying to get this adjusted.
And if you just leave that device where it is, it'll help or pick it up on his device. So, great. So, hi, Shabbat Shalom. I'm Rabbi Goldenberg, and it's really a pleasure to see you here on a Saturday afternoon to talk about a really important and difficult human rights issue. Talk about mass incarceration and racism in our criminal justice system. And we're, before I even introduce the theme a little more, I just need to acknowledge that Andy Schatz, our social action chair, who organized this whole thing, was not able to be here today because of a family health emergency, and everyone is fine. So, but he needs to be with his daughter right now. So I'm wearing a number of hats, and I'm going to try and juggle them as well as I can, but I hope you'll forgive me also, because Andy was supposed to moderate this panel, and he is not only social action chair, but a lawyer and president of the Connecticut ACLU, and is much more articulate about legal issues, criminal justice issues, than I am as a rabbi. So I'm relying a lot on his notes today and help from my panelists too, to keep our conversation going, but I'm not so worried. So the reason why we're gathered on this particular day is because it's become a national day to recognize human rights issues in the Jewish community. We call it Human Rights Shabbat. And there are around 200 synagogues across the country, really on different weekends throughout December, depending on everyone's schedules, but around 200 synagogues of all different streams, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, who are exploring human rights issues this month. And that's, this event is organized on the national level by Tru'ah, which is a rabbinic organization, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, on whose board I sat for many years and actually chaired for a few years. And this organization, Tru'ah, encompasses 1,800 rabbis across the country, also from all different streams of Judaism, from the liberal to the Orthodox. And Tru'ah has campaigns on human rights in North America and in Israel and occupied territories. Some of the campaigns include slavery and human trafficking, Islamophobia, the human rights of African migrants to Israel, the Bedouin community in Israel, and of Palestinians in the occupied territories. And Tru'ah's campaigns against racism in the criminal justice system, including the issue of mass incarceration, these campaigns are really an extension of our work that began many years ago with a campaign against US-sponsored torture, especially around the war on terror, that also expanded a few years later into a campaign against solitary confinement. So today, we are also, as a congregation, continuing a theme that we've been exploring of what Andy calls celebrating diversity, trying to see and understand the perspectives and narratives of others. So our focus being on the problem of racism in the criminal justice system and mass incarceration, and the fact that the incarcerated in this country are disproportionately people of color and the poor. And I want to just slip a little bit of Torah in here and just say that I preached these high holidays on this issue. I had just read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, over the summer. I highly, highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet. And discovered some really wonderful Jewish texts, and some of which we'll study in a moment. One of which says, that we're not studying at the moment, says that really Jewish law frowns upon building a town with a locked gate and a gatehouse. That we can have a wall for defensive measures, but we shouldn't lock our gate from the inside and have a gatehouse at the edge of our town. So what does this have to do with mass incarceration? It's not about locking ourselves in. It's really the reason why we frown on that is because if the gates are not open, that we're not able to hear the cries of the suffering beyond our gates. And as I was driving here, just from our beautiful little idyllic lunch in beautiful idyllic little Chester, right? And very, very white Chester. I was driving here thinking, I hope people come. Right? And what is it that will move us as a community out here in our town to hear the cries of the suffering and to see that actually that suffering is our suffering? And that it is not an us and them experience, that we're not exploring an issue that's about other people, that this is about our community. This is about our country. So the plan for this afternoon is that we have some wonderful panelists here. We'll allow each person on the panel to speak for about 15 minutes. And then I have some questions that Andy prepared for me to ask you guys. And then we'll open it up for your questions and more of a discussion among all of us. And I plan to end by, I would say, 3:15 or so, and then we'll have refreshments after. And I want to thank Social Action Committee members who provided those today. So I was going to start with a little bit of background in really just a few statistics to give us a bit of a picture of the issue from the federal level, and then I'm going to hand it off to David McGuire of the ACLU to give some background from the state level, just to get us started, and then I'll introduce our panelists. So these facts that I'm sharing with you come from a document published by the Drug Policy Alliance in New York. In the United States, we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. These statistics are mostly, I believe, from 2013 or before. So in 2013, we had 1.5 million drug arrests, 80% of those arrests for possession only. 16% of the incarcerated in that year were for drug violations. So it's really important just to see that drugs are a major driver in filling our prisons with nonviolent offenders, who then may end up being transformed into more violent and more hopeless by being in prison. That is an implication here. And then really what is so startling and disturbing, and what Michelle Alexander really brings out in her book, is that countrywide, 77% of federal drug prisoners and 57% of state drug prisoners are Black or Latino, despite being only 30% of the population, and despite the fact that drug use occurs at similar rates across all ethnic groups in our country. Okay, so 77% of federal drug prisoners are Black or Latino. In this book, The New Jim Crow, Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, what Michelle Alexander discovers is that the issue of incarceration actually is just the tip of the iceberg, and that a high percentage of the African American urban male population may never have actually served time, but has been effectively removed in a way from community, from society, from benefits, from supports that we offer, from federal benefits, and from effectively being the heads of their families. And this is due to this system, our penal system, our criminal justice system, where there's such discretion. We were talking about this over lunch. Discretion used by the police in arrests, discretion used by prosecutors in the kinds of charges, and then by judges. We're really talking about with things like mandatory minimum sentences imposed on them already, but then their discretion in terms of accepting a guilty plea, which we were talking about earlier. And then this box that we're required to check on employment applications if one has been convicted of a felony, and that's for work, for in the public sector and in the private sector. And all of this whole system is really miscalibrated, is the word I would use. I don't know if that's the right, that even is a word. Badly calibrated, and combines really to deprive mostly men of color, of rights that we all enjoy: the right to vote, the right to housing, benefits, food benefits, and employment. So I'm going to pass it over to David to add on the Connecticut layer to this.
So all the disparities that were just alluded to exist here in Connecticut as well at our state system. We're making a lot of progress. For the first time in a while, we're moving in the right direction, but it's important that people really listen to these conversations and spread them. So in Connecticut, our prison population spiked about 4 or 5 years ago at over 20,000 in the state of Connecticut. We're down today under 16,000. We're at a 17-year low today. And we expect a drop of another 300 or so prisoners before the new year. So we're moving in the right direction, but those racial disparities in our criminal justice system do exist. And we have to do more to all take our part in fixing that and realizing the problem. So nothing really to add other than we have those same problems here in Connecticut.
Okay, thank you. So let me introduce our panelists, and I'll say that I have like multiple page bios for some, and I'm not going to read them all, and just know that, trust that that we have some really important voices here today that can really teach us a lot on many levels from different angles. So just on the most basic level here, I introduced myself. I'll be the first panelist. And then we have George Chochos to my right, who is a former convict, who is now a minister and studying for ministry at Yale Divinity, and who got his 2 bachelor degrees and a master's, while incarcerated, and then was able to get into the Yale Divinity School, I believe the first parolee to be able to transfer to another state for higher education, and who's a real activist. He was just talking about just making his first trip down to Washington to speak, and I'm sure you'll share about that, and to lobby on this issue. So George is going to speak from the perspective of a Christian, a Christian leader, and really from an intensely personal perspective, and I'm really honored that you're here to share your story. After George speaks, we're going to hear from Tammy Lanier. Did I say your last name correctly? Okay. Who is not only the criminal justice chair of the Connecticut NAACP, is that correct? But is a chief probation officer in Norwich. So, and if you see her bio, I mean, an incredible amount of public service and social advocacy in southeastern Connecticut and in Norwich related to alcohol and drug dependence and the Second Chance program and issues related to juveniles, the Juvenile Review Board in Norwich. And she's also active in the ACLU of Connecticut, but really comes at this, I guess, from many angles, professionally, personally, having really seen the system up close and personal, and as an activist for change. And then lastly, we have David McGuire, who actually has been with us here before. It's really great to have you back. And he joined the ACLU of Connecticut on staff in 2007. He's currently the Legislative and Policy Director of the ACLU in Connecticut, and his primary areas of legal interest are police accountability, digital privacy, and free speech issues. And I want to read this. I think this is important. He's also taken a leading role in pressing for police accountability legislation and was instrumental in passing laws to reform police complaint procedures and police use of tasers. Just on a kind of personal communal note, a member, a young Jewish gentleman who comes here often to pray with me, developmentally disabled adult whose brother was killed by police misusing a taser just, I think, a year ago. So that really resonates with me. Especially from, I think probably from all three of your perspectives, but I guess especially from David and Tammy, I know that we'll be hearing also about what we can do. We're not just here to learn and get kind of depressed, but to really be inspired and prodded towards making a change, which is really possible, I'm hearing, in this state and in this country at this time. So you'll be hearing from everyone in a moment, but you gotta listen to me some more now. So that's what's kind of funny about wearing Andy's hat and mine. I am now the first panelist. And what I wanted to do is shift out of just speaking at you and do a little bit of study together. And so you'll see on your seats, or hopefully you grabbed them when you came in, you should have 2 pieces of paper. Maybe raise your hand if you don't have the handouts, and maybe Melinda can hand them to you, because everyone really should have a handout. I'll be reading from it and referring to it. There's 2 packets up on the front row if anyone wants to run up and grab those. Anyone else? Okay. So, thank you, Melinda. So I thought I would actually put out a Hanukkah menorah, just as a symbol today. Hanukkah begins tomorrow night. And the first page that I want to look at is kind of based around a text about Hanukkah. It looks like this. This is a text study that was put together by Trua. We're not going to do the whole thing, but I just wanted to touch on, I'll spend like 5 minutes on each side of this piece of paper. So for our first little bit of study, this is more of a general look at the question of whether racism in the criminal justice system, this issue we're looking at today, whether it's an extension of the civil rights movement. And kind of the question of whether, now that we don't have those celebrated charismatic leaders of the 1960s, right, that we tend to really celebrate, is it our job now? Can we be those people? Can we take this issue forward? And what is the meaning of a struggle, kind of spiritually, what is the meaning of a struggle for civil rights and human rights in general? So this page is set up like a page of Talmud, which is a traditional way of studying Jewish text. Talmud usually has the primary text in the middle of the page and then commentaries around the edges. So I'm going to start with the text in the middle of the page where it says the basic mitzvah of Hanukkah. Does everyone see that? I'm going to stand. Okay. So this actually comes from the Talmud. I could say anywhere from 2nd to 5th century text, all right? And the rabbis write here that the basic mitzvah of Hanukkah is to light 1 candle per household each night, which is interesting, right? That's not necessarily when we think about Hanukkah what we do, but back then, that's how they thought of it. Those who do this beautifully light 1 candle for each member of the household. But they didn't necessarily have these back then, I'm wondering, right? Important special candle holders, but everyone would light 1 candle for the household each night. Among those who act especially beautifully, there's a debate. Beit Shammai, which is one school of thought, says on the first night you should light 8 candles and 1 fewer each subsequent night. Right? That was what Beit Shammai says. For those of you who know about Hanukkah, you know that the law did not go with Beit Shammai. Okay, you don't do it that way. Right? Beit Hillel says, on the first night, light 1 candle, and then 1 more each subsequent night, until the last night you have 8, right? That's what we do. All right. So, Ula said, 2 later sages in the land of Israel debated their reasons. Rabbi Yossi bar Avin and Rabbi Yossi bar Zeveda once said, Beit Shammai's reasoning corresponds to the number of days of Hanukkah still to come, right? So you decrease because you only have 7 nights left and then 6 nights left, right? Beit Hillel's reasoning is about the days that have passed. So if you like one more for the days that have passed. The other one says Beit Shammai's reasoning corresponds to the bull sacrifice of Sukkot. So Hanukkah actually replaced the holiday of Sukkot, which is a holiday where they sacrificed bulls in the time of the temple. And on Sukkot, they would do 1 fewer bull each night of Sukkot, so it makes sense, 1 fewer candle each night of Hanukkah. And Beit Hillel's reasoning is, and here we finally get to the spiritual meaning, because we increase holiness and do not decrease. It's a common Jewish principle. Right? So that's just the basic principle here, that in life, in observance, in worshiping God, serving God, we want to increase in holiness, not decrease. We want to increase in light, not decrease. Okay. So then we have some later commentaries around the edges. And I just want to look at the top left and the top right. So the top left, we have Rabbi Shlomo Ephraim Lubavitch. I don't even know if I'm saying that correct. And he is explaining this as an allegory for the body and the soul. In his view, Beit Shammai's system has the candles represent the body and victory over the enemy who wants to physically destroy us. Just as a candle dwindles over time, so too the human body dwindles over time. Beit Hillel's system has the candles represent the soul, celebrating a spiritual victory, since the soul becomes wiser and wiser with age. I think is really neat. So that's why the Hanukkah lights are lit in descending order, because they represent our soul as it grows in wisdom. All right. So where it says contemporary, this is a commentary on a commentary by a rabbi friend of mine, Rachel Kahn-Troster. She says, human rights movements gain their strength from the power of the people as a whole, the soul of a movement, rather than the individual bodies who take part. As individuals, we might tire, our bodies might weaken, but it is the light of our collective power, which grows brighter and brighter over time, that gives us the strength to go on. I find that very moving. Likewise, charismatic leaders come and go, and we might think it is their light that inspires us and produces change, but they too are bodies which wane and dwindle. A truly wise leader nurtures the souls of the movement, builds towards a systemic victory. He or she lets their light burn with others rather than standing aloft as the shamash. The shamash is it's a little taller than the others, the shamash candle, right? So this is just about kind of the spirit of collective action, that the idea that although we've had charismatic leaders in the past, they come and go, but the soul, the spirit of the movement continues and can build and grow in life. I'm not going to read the whole thing on the right because I'm running out of time, but the other commentator on the top right is talking about history and how history relates to the movements and what we're reading. So Beit Hillel believes, I'll just read it real quick. So Beit Shammai believes that the candles commemorate the defeat of the enemy. As generations pass, it becomes harder to relate to the historical joy, so the candles diminish. Beit Hillel believes that the candles commemorate the rededication of the temple. A rededication implies that the old is renewed continually. So again, this idea that what happened long ago can still happen today. And Rabbi Jill Jacobs, I'm just going to read some excerpts. She talks about how we often in our social justice work draw on the past. We recall the Jewish engagement in the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, and a lot of communities still kind of get there, get up and go from the 1960s, and still are kind of drawing on that. But she says, memory only carries us so far. We cannot become so absorbed in memory that we fail to respond to the challenges of today, and to realize that today's justice struggles may be different and also similar to those of the past, just as the rededicated temple could never be exactly as it was. Just to give a little context, so right during the time that we celebrated Hanukkah, the Maccabees rededicated the temple that had been desecrated by the Greeks, right? So the new rededicated temple could never be exactly as it was. She's saying that, these candles commemorate that rededication of ourselves to a struggle that continues and that changes over time. And I really see this issue that we're talking about today as and the fact that we're here caring about it, it's a rededication of ourselves to this next stage of civil rights that we need to be a part of. So if we turn the page over, I'll spend 5 minutes on this. Some specific texts about criminal justice. From the Torah, from Deuteronomy, it says, "You shall put judges and officers of the law in all your gates that the Eternal your God is giving you for your tribes, and you shall judge the people." The important phrase is judgment with justice. And in Hebrew, that's mishpat tzedek. So the question is, well, why can't you just say, make justice, have justice happen? Why do you have to say, have just justice? It's really right. Judgment with justice. So Sforno, the next text, comes in the 16th century. He says, what does this mean, judgment with justice? They should adjudicate justly so as not to be soft on one person and harsh on another. Amen. Right? So it's about the means, right? The means of achieving justice. Whether, we have to seek out justice for people who've been wronged or hurt by criminal activity, right? That justice must be sought, but that the system must also have justice within it. The means have to be just. The Torah goes on in other places to recognize that wealth and power, or the lack thereof, can sway the justice system, right? That's a real risk. And that those with wealth and power should not be given, easier sentences, right, than those who do not have that. And that we always have to be recalibrating the system. It also says in Leviticus that you have to have just weights and measures, so that, and that's not just in business when you're weighing out money, what you're paying for a product, right? But that we need to have our systems of measurement, our systems of weights and measures and justice be calibrated justly. So that's on the justice system overall. And then the last piece that I'll talk about is where it says your brother. And by the way, there's so much in Torah and Talmud about criminal justice because the rabbis saw themselves as trying to create a just society, right? So there are lots more laws than where these come from, but these are the ones that I have for you today. So another verse from Deuteronomy, this is about, and I talked about this on Yom Kippur, so you may recognize it from my sermon. When you have to take someone who's been found guilty out to be flogged, which was a typical punishment, they actually didn't incarcerate people in the Torah. We don't have jails in the Bible, okay? What they do is flog people, all right? So if the guilty one is to be flogged, the magistrate shall have him lie down and be given lashes in his presence by count as his guilt warrants. Very important, okay? You don't just get to wail on him for as long as you want, okay? He may be given up to 40 lashes, but not more, lest being flogged further to excess, your brother be degraded before your eyes. Dignity is very important here, right? We don't degrade our brother, and what the tradition picks up on is this word brother. Your brother. We don't say, lest being flogged further to excess, the criminal be degraded, the felon be degraded, right? Your brother. Your brother. Okay? And then, so later in the Midrash, Sifrei Ki Tetzei, they go on further to explain. So why does this verse in the Torah say, your brother will be degraded before your eyes? From the moment he is flogged, he is your brother. That's interesting too, right? If you didn't even think of him as your brother before, now you have to think of him as your brother. From this, it was said, all who are liable for excommunication and are flogged immediately are exempted from excommunication, right? Meaning, there are some times when someone needs to be separated out from the community, right? But once the term of their excommunication is over, they've had their punishment, they are immediately brought back into the community. Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel said, all day the text calls him wicked, as it says, if the wicked person is subject to lashes, but from the time that he is flogged, the text calls him your brother, as it says, your brother is flogged. So, I think this is a very powerful text in terms of seeing those in our society who may have fallen off the path, right? We're trying to bring back on the path of teshuvah, we would call it in Hebrew, right? Of repentance, of coming back into the community, that we need to see ourselves in our right? See that we are not actually separate. So I'm going to turn it over now to my brother George. Yeah.
Should move the microphone over.
Sure. And we will have plenty of time for questions later, so if you have questions about the texts or anything I just said, please note them and bring them up when we come to the question and answer period.
Well, I would think this would get easier every time I get a chance to, where I'm privileged to kind of share my story. A little better? But it doesn't get any easier because, as many of us know, when bringing up memories, many times our emotions are attached to those memories. And some of my memories bring up a high intensity of emotion. So if you see my emotional level intensifying, just pray for me. First I want to say thank you to Rabbi Rachel and to this distinguished panel and to all of you for coming to talk about an issue and a situation that is near and dear to my heart that I've experienced personally. Anytime I am afforded the opportunity to share my story, I always want to preface it by saying that I've been blessed tremendously at the expense that sometimes I feel of other people's pain. And I've never wanted whatever I accomplished ever overshadow the period of my life where I caused some serious pain to people. And I think of the victims in my prior life often. And there's many, beginning with my family and moving onward. So I'm always mindful of that. And I'd like to say that before I ever get a chance to talk about myself or what's happened inside of my life. However, my name is George Chochos. I am a minister now. I wasn't always that. I was adopted as a baby by a Greek family, a very loving Greek family. They were very ethnically Greek. My parents were first generation Greeks. My grandparents came here from Greece. As a young age, a friend of mine recently showed me something in the newspaper from the maybe it was the late 1970s or early 1980s, where someone from the county jail had come to my classroom and they took statements from the children. And one of the people that was quoted was me. And I guess I said, it's terrible that people have to do drugs. I hope that's never me. And when I get older, I want to become a public defender. I want to become a lawyer so I can help people. Sometimes childhood dreams do not